Hey everyone, today we're doing our all staff on cultural competency. This is another one we try to hit on every year. So just good information on how we can be more culturally competent when we've been working with our residents. So move my little face here. Um, to understand this, we need to start by talking about what is culture. So culture is learned patterns of perception, values, and behaviors shared by a group of people that are dynamic and heterogeneous. Um, so a lot of times people think of culture as like just where you're from, like your ethnicity, um, your country of origin, but it's a lot more than that. And we're all a part of many different cultures. So when we look down here at this slide, this picture, sorry, each person belongs to several cultures. So your national culture, your religion, your ethnic group, your generation, social class, your workplace. So even at Blue Sky, we have our own kind of Blue Sky culture, like how we act at Blue Sky, how we dress, how we talk. So everywhere has kind of their own culture, and we're all a part of lots of different cultures. And then what makes up a culture over here? Lots of things makes up a culture. Could be your language that you speak, medical care, religion, how you raise your children, what food you eat, folk art, celebrations, jokes, manners, how you dress and clothe yourself, your working schedule. All that makes up a culture. So, we're all trying to aim to be culturally competent, meaning that we want to understand, appreciate, and effectively interact with people from cultures or systems different from our own, which everyone that we work with at Blue Sky, every one of our residents, we might share some aspects of culture with them. Like we probably share kind of a Blue Sky culture with them, but we have, very different cultures. They have very different cultures than our own. And so to best care for them, we have to know kind of how to best work with them and work with them in their culture. So there's kind of four steps in this model or four parts of this model that help us to be culturally competent. There's no particular order, um, and it's kind of revolving. So we see here it's ongoing. You never um, kind of become a master of cultural competency. It's something that we always work towards, and um, we always need to kind of sharpen up this skill. So awareness of one's own cultural worldview, attitude, so being open and accepting, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. No, I'm not. Okay. An open and accepting attitude towards cultural differences. Skills, so we'll talk about some skills that we can use when we're working with people of other cultures and how we can gain some knowledge of other cultures and kind of help be a um, better staff member when working with people with other cultures. So the first one on this list is awareness. To gain cultural awareness, we first need to understand how our own cultural worldview um, and how this impacts how we work with others. So the first step is to really be aware of um, what our own what our own culture is and how that might impact how we work with others. So I said there's no real order to this, but I would say that this is kind of the first step. Being cultural competent, we can't really do that unless we understand what our culture is and how we look at other cultures. So you want to think about your own values, your own biases, and your own upbringing. So, what is a value that's important in your life? What is something that maybe you were raised with, or maybe you go to church and this is a value you obtained at church. You want to think about your biases. So, kind of with values that often means that sometimes we have biases. So, if we have a value of respecting our elders, we might have a bias towards people who don't respect our elders. Like, this is how we think is the right way to do it. So, anybody who does it differently, we might have a bias towards that. And biases can be conscious, like we can know that this is a bias, and they might be unconscious. We might not really realize, oh, we're kind of biased towards this culture or this behavior. So, and your upbringing. So, how are you raised? A lot of our residents, I would say, were raised very different than us. Um, and they probably had very different cultures of origin. So that's important to kind of recognize and be aware of. So just some things to think about. Think about the importance of respect in your own culture. I know like where I grew up and in my family, respect was very important, especially for like elders and caregivers and people of authority. So how would you respond to an individual who is not raised with these kind of values? I would say that some of our residents were not. Nothing against them, but a lot of them were raised in kind of chaotic homes. They might not have had the maybe the parents that we did, or the extended family to help raise children. So, how would you respond to somebody who has a very different they're not as respectful. That's not a value of theirs. How would you work with that? Because that can be very frustrating. Think about your experience as a caregiver in the field. Does your experience with similar patients ever impact your caregiver duties for your current patient? I would say that it's a trap that all of us have probably fallen into, where somebody admits and they have anxiety or schizophrenia. We're like, oh, I know that. I've worked with somebody with anxiety and schizophrenia. I know what they're going to look like and how they're going to act. But you don't. You don't know their culture. You don't know how schizophrenia and anxiety have played into their life. So sometimes we can fall into this trap of overgeneralizing. Like everybody's the same because they have these diagnoses and not looking at them as a person and how their culture can impact them as person. Other things you want to consider is like your religion and how you might work with somebody who has a very opposing religion or no religion at all. If you're Christian and you will have to come across somebody who's an atheist. How would you work with that? Your family dynamics and your relationships. Um, maybe you're very close with your family and you have a resident who is not very close with their family and they don't want to be, or whatever it is. How does that play into how you can relate to that resident and care for them? Um, this one's an important one. How conflicts or issues are handled. So this is every family culture is very different on this one. So some families are raised with, oh, if we have a conflict, we all sit down and talk about it. Or, however you manage a conflict or a family, or if an issue comes up. Um, a lot of our patients or residents come from very complex and unstable upbringings where there wasn't good communication, there wasn't good ways of handling conflicts or issues. So a lot of times they had to resort to negative behaviors to get their needs met as a kid. So maybe it was, oh, I have to yell, I have to scream, I have to act out. That's how I get attention. And so those things are kind of learned, and that's part of their culture. So when we see somebody who acts like that, I want you to kind of think of like, oh, how might this be a part of their culture, instead of just kind of like a negative behavior? Like, how is this how they were taught and how they learned in their culture? Communication styles. Some people might be very loud. Fast talkers, they speak their mind. Other people might be quieter. Some people, cursing is common in their communication style. Other people, it's not. So, like when I do individual therapy with people, I have to kind of figure out what is their communication style and speak to them on their level. Like if it's somebody who curses, like I'll curse with them because that's how they talk. Like that's appropriate for them. Other people, that's completely inappropriate. They don't want to talk like that. So it's finding, how people communicate and, I don't ever want you to like feel like you have to communicate differently if it's against your value. Like if you don't cuss, like I don't expect you to cuss with somebody, but just kind of understanding how people communicate and kind of relating to them through their communication style. We also have people who maybe have like a lower um, cognition, like, people who maybe act a little younger. We have, one at Vista and one at an individual at Santa Ana. And so when we communicate with them, we might have to use simpler terms, or people who speak English as a second language. Like we can't use the same kind of communication as we would with someone else. Manners. Um, we have an individual at Santa Ana who's a big like kisser, hugger, and that's a part of her culture. And so that can be very concerning to other people. Other people don't like that, but for her, that's her manner. So we kind of need to teach her how do we incorporate how you how your manners are, how your culture is, and how we interact with others. Because we've had issues before. We go on an outing and she's done that to strangers, and we're like, hey, like that's not how we can interact with people in public. Like, a friend, if they want to kiss and hug on your cheek or whatever, like that's okay. But so just understanding, how their culture plays into that, how medical issues are handled, things like that. All of that is impacted by their culture. Next is your attitude. And this can be very difficult, especially if you are working with somebody who is very different from your culture. So this is accepting cultures that are different from yours and may even go against your cultural values. So kind of like we talked before, if you're, a Christian or you're religious and you're working with somebody who's not or who's, very opposed to that, that could be very, very hard for you. And you got to kind of balance these two of awareness of your own culture and your attitude to best work with that person. Um, Another piece of this is understanding that patients have the right to live their lives according to their cultural preferences, even if it differs from ours. So even if, I wouldn't live my life that way or you wouldn't. And I know we see that with some of our residents, and we're always trying to get them to eat healthier and to stop smoking and to do all these exercise because, we know that that's healthy for them. But their whole lives, they've probably grown up in a culture where drinking soda is appropriate. Not appropriate, I should say it's not appropriate, but drinking soda is the norm. We have a soda 3 times a day. That's what our family does. We smoke cigarettes all the time. That's what our family does. That's how we bond. A lot of people bond over food too. So like, we have big meals with our family and we eat all this bad food together. And like that's a part of their culture. And so even if it's different from us, we can educate them on healthier alternatives, but it's their choice to live how they want to live. Um, yeah. So cigarettes, junk food, soda, not exercising. A lot of times, people would just automatically assume, oh, you're just lazy, or, because you're doing things different from how I would do it, you're wrong. You're lazy, you don't care. But I want us to try and consider how it's not always a fault of the patient. It's just kind of how they were raised, and it's part of their culture. It's not probably a habit. I mean, smoking and eating bad food is not a habit most people pick up later in life. It's something that they grew up with, and it brings them some comfort, and it's a part of their culture. So just considering that, using active listening and curiosity. I find this part really interesting, like learning about patients' culture and understanding how their behaviors may be a part of their culture. Um, so we kind of used this example earlier, like a patient who grew up in a family where the only way to communicate and the only way to get attention was to yell and scream and maybe even act out. Like that's the only way that they were able to get any resolution or talk to their parents or whatever it may be. Um, and so that behavior is not just going to stop. Like that's something that they've learned. That's a communication style that often works for them. The other one is like a quote I've used before, like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So for a lot of our residents, they've lived in group homes or facilities for a lot of their life. And in big facilities, if anybody's ever worked there, you learn your staffing ratio is a little lower. So more patients to staff, it's hard to get attention. And so a lot of our patients learned, well, I can get attention if I start yelling, if I start acting up, the squeaky wheel gets the attention. Um, and so I'm sure a lot of our residents picked up that behavior at one time or the other. And now they don't need to. We have two staff for 10 patients and during the day. So it's reteaching them, that was a part of your culture then, when you lived in a big facility, that's how you got your needs met. You don't need to do that here. Like we are going to give you the care you need, the attention you need if you don't act like that. So kind of reacclimating them to a new culture. Knowledge, kind of just touched on this in the last one, but learning about different cultures and worldviews. So a few cultures, this is just a few, this list could be pages long, but a few of the cultures, just when I was thinking about our Blue Sky residents, some of the cultures that we see are physical and sexual abuse survivors. We have, several residents who are open about their past of physical and sexual abuse. That's a culture in of itself. That impacts a lot of behaviors. That impacts how they act, maybe some fears they have, definitely behaviors. Trauma survivors, we've had people who've witnessed murders. We've had people who were in terrible car wrecks. We've had people who've lost loved ones to suicide. Trauma definitely impacts your culture. Individuals recovering from substance abuse, quite a few of those. Um, And yeah, we could talk all day about how that impacts their culture, or how that is a part of their culture. Native Americans, um, yeah, lots of different cultures we could talk about at Blue Sky. Another way that you can get some good information on our patients and their culture is reading their treatment plans, which we should all be doing, and looking over their assessment. So everybody before they come in gets an assessment, and every year we do an updated assessment on them. So um, looking at their treatment plan helps us understand how we can kind of work with these behaviors from a culturally appropriate stance. So if a patient is being demanding, we don't want to scold them. We don't want to say yell at them or tell them that's childish or whatever, because for some reason that behavior has become a part of their culture. Somewhere in the line that worked. Being demanding, whether it was in their upbringing, whether it was at a prior facility, being demanding got them what they needed. Rather, we want to encourage them to display appropriate behaviors for this new culture. So at Blue Sky, we have a new culture, and we're not demanding. We are polite. We ask for things. We wait for staff to get it for us. We don't need to be demanding because in this new culture, staff are more responsive. Um, the same with like language. If somebody's being mean and cursing and yelling at you, we want to encourage them to use good behavior, or sorry, good language. Um, they don't need to use that language anymore. And the best way to do that is through modeling. So I've had, people who've like had an issue with the patient. Oh, they're just yelling all the time and they're doing this. And then I watch them interact and I'm like, well, you're doing the same thing to them. Like that's how they're learning to do this. Like because, you know, that's how it's being modeled to them. So it's hard. It's a lot easier said than done, but we have to model that good behavior. That's the only way that they're going to learn new behaviors is if we show them this is the new culture. This is the Blue Sky culture. You're not losing your own culture, but you're coming into this new culture, and this is how we act here. And then assessments, they help give us an understanding of where our patients came from and give them insight to our culture. So, it's a biopsychosocial assessment. So we ask them, directly, like, where are you from? Where were you born? Where were you raised? Who's in your family? Who are your family members? So that kind of gives us a really good sense of their culture. And the last one is skills. So this is when we're going to talk about exactly kind of some of these skills that help us work with patients of different culture. So we talked about, I think all of these a little bit, but so understanding and implementing different language styles. So um, you all know that you communicate with different patients differently. Some patients do well with kind of a sterner approach. Like, I think, I'm trying to think, we have a guy over at Colt who, when it's his time to shower, he doesn't really want to. And so he does better. We know if we're like, it's time to shower. Like, we're a little firmer with him. We're still polite, but he does better with a little firmer approach. Then we have other people who are more kind of jokey and silly, and that kind of firm approach doesn't really work with them. Like they want more of a kind of a silly, fun interaction, and that's how they're able to communicate better. So it's finding kind of the different language style of the patient. And then we talked about considering the mental age of the patient. If they're operating in a mental age of 8, we're not going to try to talk to them like they're 30. They're not going to understand. They're probably going to get frustrated. So we want to kind of come down to their level and communicate with them where they're at. Um, Cursing, some people are so offended by cursing. If you're cursing at someone, that's inappropriate. But for a lot of our patients, like that's been a part of their culture, and that's how they talk. And so, if they're not bothering anybody, they're adults. That's how they talk. Um, Nonverbal cues, talked about this one too. Like, do you like to be comforted by, me rubbing your back? Or touching is a big no-no for you. We know, like that one resident we talked about at Santa Ana, like her culture is big on kissing, hugging. That can be very inappropriate for some people. But for her, it's just kind of teaching her, like, okay, that's part of your culture. That's fine. We still need to kind of know when it's appropriate and when it's not. Um, Giving empathy. We should be doing this all the time with all of our residents. Understanding that, like, a lot of time their behavior is part of their culture. And I say like every behavior has a purpose. Why are they yelling? Why are they acting out? It's probably because it's worked. So being empathetic to like, okay, you have a need that you want met. you're going about it the wrong way. But I'm empathetic that you kind of are frustrated right now. Let me help you find a way to kind of meet that need appropriately. Verify your understanding. So if you're talking to somebody, especially somebody new, and you're not quite sure what their communication style is, are you understanding everything that I'm saying? So maybe ask them to repeat it back to you if it's something important. Um, if it's a new rule in the home, we're trying to clarify. Okay, do you remember what I said to you? Do you understand when you can have a soda? Be mindful of humor. Talked about that a little bit too. Some people find humor can be taken the wrong way very easily. So be mindful when you're using jokes and humor, and if it's something that a resident doesn't like, maybe they're not the best to joke with. And then just be non-judgmental. So be understanding of kind of how their culture got them to where they are today and, the reasoning for some of the things they're doing. Next step. So, like we said at the very beginning, cultural competency is always ongoing. You'll never be a master in cultural competency. You're always going to come across a new culture or a new person. So, always be willing to learn about new cultures, be curious and open, and don't assume you know someone's culture just because you're familiar with a piece of it. So, like, especially like diagnoses, when we see, like, oh, I know somebody with anxiety, I know how they're going to be. You don't. They're very different from the last person you saw with anxiety. So, don't assume that you know who they are or how they're going to be just because you understand maybe a piece of them. Each individual who comes into Blue Sky has their own cultural background, and they are adjusting to their Blue Sky culture. So they're learning a whole new culture when they move in, and that can be very hard. So use patience and empathy, use that modeling to show them, okay, maybe you yelled at your other placement, but here we don't yell. We have an issue, we're going to talk quietly. Maybe you need to go to your room and calm down for a few minutes and then come back out and then we talk about it. Be curious, be willing to understand maybe why they act the way they do, what their background is. Things like that can help you really work with them better, and attempt to learn about the individual and their culture. And so we have some discussion questions here, so we can go through these. Or we can, if you have specific client-related questions or patient questions, we can delve into those as well.